Hi, and welcome to 2 plus 2 equals cabbage. In this video, we'll be covering how to deploy a Windows instance to Azure with Terraform. We'll go over things like GitHub, Azure prerequisites, Terraform project files, we'll talk about security, and then at the end, we'll destroy things. All right, let's figure it out together.
Well, as we begin, we're going to make a brief stop at our GitHub page where we have all of the sample code that we'll be using throughout the videos. In this case, we're doing the Terraform Azure base, where we will deploy a Windows instance to Azure, much like we did in previous videos for AWS. All the files are here, and we'll jump into VS Code to actually look into the files, but everything is here for reference purposes, so you can clone this repository and get started on your own. But let's go over to VS Code and take a look. Here we are in VS Code, taking a look at our Terraform configuration files. And like other projects, I've arranged things modularly. So we've got different files for different functions. So that makes it easy to add things or take things away. But a lot of the basics still apply. One thing that will be different from different cloud providers, one to the next, will be the naming of things within the environments are different. For example, in Azure, where we're working today, the networking construct is called a VNet, where in AWS and OCI and GCP, you've got things like VPCs, VCNs, VPCs. So naming can get a little bit confusing, trying to keep it straight, but for the most part, the constructs are similar. Some of them function a little bit differently, but yeah, naming is the one thing that's usually different between the different providers. So here we're starting off with just creating our Terraform provider. Very simple. We need this in order for things to function. If we didn't have this, our Terraform Apply or a plan would fail. And we've got our Azure provider, which gives us the Azure RM, which is the basis for creating everything within Azure. We'll see we're pulling a lot of different variables from the Terraform TFRs file, subscription ID, client secret tenant ID, all of these things that we gathered from when we did our Azure credentials creation. If you haven't done that yet, here's a link to the video so you can see how to do that. And we've got our locals. Locals is where we specify things that generally apply to naming conventions within Azure. So we've got VNet names, resource groups, subnet names, all these things that we name within Azure. I'm a little bit more familiar with Azure, so I've named a lot of things, maybe more than I've done in some of the other cloud providers, but this is where this is all done. We've got our Azure networking. This is where we set up the basics for the Azure network. And we've got our /16 here that we're using, 10.4.0.0/16 will be our network that we use within Azure. And then we've got our subnet, which is just a /24 that we'll be using for just where we're going to put our Windows instance. We're doing static routing, and I like to do route tables for everything within the environment so I can tightly control where traffic can route and put less dependency on the defaults, because the defaults can sometimes let you route to places that you may not want to from a security perspective. Security group, in this case, generally pretty open. We are allowing our public IP, which is where I sit, to RDP into the instance once it's created. Variables, a lot of the same things from other projects, but specific to Azure. And in Windows, the Windows file looks similar to other projects. We are still disabling the Windows firewall to make sure that we can RDP into the device when it's ready. Syntax is a little bit different, as you'll notice, from AWS to Azure to OCI to GCP. So that's one thing that's different about all these files and all the projects you'll see in GitHub is we've got to make the same thing happen in multiple cloud environments, but they don't always work the same way, and we have to use different coding in order to do that. And then we've got our Terraform TFRs template, which is where you'll take that and customize based on your environment. Things that are required, like the subscription ID, the client ID, client secret tenant ID, required items that we pull from Azure when we created our credentials. In this environment, the location is basically the region that we're deploying to. If you remember back in the AWS video, we could specify a region as one name and a location as another friendly name. In this case, we're doing the same for both using one variable, and then the environment name is just a tag that tells you, what the environment is, maybe what it means, a keyword that makes sense to you. And here we can also, for our Windows instance, we can specify a username and a password. Makes it easier to do our first login, so that's nice. But let's go ahead and start up, and we'll do the Terraform Init. This checks the local operating environment, creates some of the structure that is needed to actually perform the commits to Azure. It'll create lock files and things like that so we can keep track of the configuration. And this will take just a minute. Okay, Terraform Init is completed, and it didn't throw us any errors, so that's a good sign. Next, we'll do Terraform Plan. And Terraform Plan goes through all of our files that we've got, everything with a .tf extension or tf vars in the example of our credentials file. And it just runs through, checks them all, makes sure there's no errors. It'll tell you in output here if there are any errors or inconsistencies in the files. And what it will output now is just a series of lines with a green plus that just says it's going to add these new things to the environment when it deploys. It's interesting to scroll through just to see everything that it will deploy. And if there were any errors, it would output them in pretty obvious text. So you would see you had an error and you had to go fix it. Usually it'll tell you the line number of the file where there's a problem. So that's helpful. And then once we do our actual apply, we'll have some output that we've specified within the files. So these things are right at our fingertips, like what's the admin username on the Windows instance, something we can set here in the Azure configuration. And we'll also get the private IP and the public IP. So the username, the public IP, and the password that we set back in the Terraform TFRs file, those are the important things that we'll need to move forward. But this went off without a hitch, so now we can do Terraform Apply. And this does the same thing that Terraform Plan does, but then it goes the extra step of actually publishing the content into Azure. So here it's asking us if we want to proceed. You just type yes, and then we'll let this run for a minute, and then we'll come back and we'll see what it looks like, and we can jump over to Azure and see what it looks like in the console. Okay, our Terraform apply to Azure is complete, and we can see here it created 11 resources. There was nothing to change or destroy, and we've got our output here, which helps us with where we go next, which is to log into the Windows instance. So we've got our public IP. At this point, we don't really care about the private IP. We're not using that for anything right now, but we've got the public IP, we've got the admin username, and we've got the admin password from our terraform.tfrs file, so we can reference that. So let's jump over to the Azure console and take a look around in there while we wait for the instance to boot. It is Windows, so it does take a minute to boot up. So let's go look at the console and see what it looks like there. From the Azure console, there's a lot of ways to get to the information that we're trying to look at here. We could go through subscriptions, we could go through resource groups, we could go through all resources. There's any number of ways to get to the things that we want, but we'll start off just going through the subscription. And then we can see our subscription here, which is called Cabbage. You can just click on that. And from here, we'll minimize that to get it out of the way. We can just go to resources, and this shows us pretty much everything that's defined within this subscription. And the different things that will be showing up in here are all things that we deployed through Terraform. One of the first things that gets created is a virtual network. And the virtual network just is the structure for networking within the environment. And it shows us that our address space is the 10.4.0.0/16. We can go through settings here and see a lot more things like subnets. So we only see the one that we created, and we notice the naming convention where SNet tells us it's a subnet. Cabbage is just my environment name tag that I used. East US is the region, and then the suffix here just tells us what this IP is. So 10.4.1.0.20/24 is the a subnet. It also lists the security group that we created allowing access, the route table that we created. So there's a lot of information here that we can look at. Not much else that we really need to look at right now, but that's where everything is. We can bounce back to resources, and then we can see we've got our Windows virtual machine here. Naming convention again, trying to keep things consistent. And this shows us that it is running, and it tells us the OS and the specs and things like that. And we've got our public IP here, which we could copy to our clipboard if we wanted to. We also have that in our Terraform output. So we're getting that information from multiple places. And back to resources. And all the other components here, when you do it on your own, feel free to bounce around and look at all the different things and see how they relate to the way it looks within the Terraform configuration. It's interesting to just see how things represent themselves in the console. So that's really all we need to look at right here now. So let's just get out of here. We'll go and open up an RDP session. We'll connect to our Windows instance and see how that looks. We're ready now to log into our Windows instance using RDP. We're on a Windows machine, so we're just using the remote desktop connection. We've input the IP address of the instance from either from the Azure portal or from the Terraform output that we created. And we've got our username specified here, so we can just click connect. And it'll ask for the password. We'll put the password in there and we'll log in. We'll just minimize Server Manager. We don't need that right now. And just to make sure we can get to the internet, we'll open up Microsoft Edge. And just take a look at the GitHub page. So we're done. We were able to take our Terraform configuration files and clone the repository to our local workstation. We then took a look at the files in VS Code just to see how everything works. We did our Terraform Init, Terraform Plan, Terraform Apply, and everything pushed. We tested our connection to our Windows instance, made sure it worked. And that was really it for the fun part. Now we just need to go and clean up and destroy our configuration so we don't have things sitting out in Azure that we're not using. And we'll just bounce over there and it'll just take a minute. All right, we're back in VS Code where we have finished our testing. So now we can come and clean up everything. So the command that we need to run here at the console is Terraform Destroy. And all this does is it goes and undoes everything that we did with the apply. So it knows what was published and it will go and just remove it all from Azure. So much easier to do it through this method than trying to do it manually with the console. Yes, I'm going to go ahead and continue. Okay, we are finished. So we can see here that it went through and destroyed everything that it created. So we should have nothing left in Azure that we don't want. And that's it. So we went from start to finish on this pretty quickly. And next things that we'll be doing with Azure, like we're doing with AWS, OCI, and GCP, is we'll have more projects. We'll do more fun things. But stay tuned to the channel for updates, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks for visiting 2 + 2 = Cabbage. If you found this video useful, like and subscribe to show me there are people out there who would like to see more of this content.